Welcome back. You're listening to The Discussion, providing a modern learning experience, sponsored by Cornerstone On Demand on Federal News Radio, part of the Federal News Network. I'm your host, Jason Miller. My guest today is John Ogren, the Chief Learning Officer of the National Weather Service, which is part of NOAA inside the Department of Commerce. John, we talked a lot about in the last segment how training happens, meaning how you develop the courses, where those ideas come from, the role the field offices play. At the same time, there are busy times of the year, without a doubt. Hurricane season starts in April. I'm sure starting in March or even February, you guys are ramping up for hurricane season. And then once you get through hurricane season, which I think ends in November, you have winter season starts. And that, again, creates a need for different types of training. So I think you guys use the term seasonal readiness. Talk a little bit about how that fits into your role as the Chief Learning Officer.
Absolutely. And that's retraining, right? That's sharpening the saw. That's getting prepared for the next season. So you're absolutely right. As we move into hurricane season, we've been training hard over the past several months during the quote off season to prepare for this year. So it's scientific. It's also how do we better communicate. It's also, make sure that our equipment's up and running. All of those offices throughout the Central Plains and the East Coast are preparing for severe weather season. So oftentimes when we're in the middle of a winter storm, we may also be starting to train for the next upcoming severe weather season, whether it be hurricanes or tornadoes, flash floods, whatever the case may be. So we're trying to stay ahead of that. And that's not new training. So we've already developed this training, but then we give the opportunity to the forecasters to kind of sharpen that saw. How can they knock the rust off, if you will, remember some of the things maybe they forgot over the previous season, and to really be prepared to meet the mission when the time comes.
Is it also a matter of looking at it? So, for instance, let's just role play real quick. As from a trainer, you guys do that a lot. We have the winter season is still feels like it's middle of the summer, but it's coming up. Are you guys looking at the training that you did last winter and say, okay, what lessons did we learn that we can now apply? And whether it may just be a new course or a tweak, or how often does that happen and when does it happen?
Yeah, we are continually updating our courses. So it's a great example for this upcoming winter. Here we are in June, about to approach July. In the August-September timeframe is really when we're going to be doing our winter weather training. And so during the summertime is when our instructors are making tweaks to that existing training that's out there. They're bringing in new satellite data, if there's new technology that's being implemented. And we also do something that's called service assessments. So anytime there's a major disaster, major weather event, whether it's a hurricane, tornado, flood, whatever the case may be, we do an internal assessment. And so we go and we talk to the media, we talk to emergency management and say, hey, we had this big disaster. How'd we do? What worked, what didn't, what can we do better? And we get a lot of feedback from both the field officers, the field forecasters, as well as our partners in that, okay, yes, this worked, this didn't, and here's something we could do differently. And so we can integrate those new best practices into our training for that upcoming season.
At the same time, you also have, for instance, let's look out. This past winter, it was a very wet winter, a lot of snow in the mountains, a lot of, especially in the West Coast. California is finally out of their drought. Does that mean you have to kind of, hey, bring in that training that maybe we haven't had to use because, more water means higher chance of fires? And then does that play into also your training? Do you have to bring stuff back into it when the weather changes, when things, if you will, ebb and flow?
Yeah, it does ebb and flow, and you certainly have a new emphasis. And you're right, with the snowy winter, we've got a lot of snow melt going on in the Rockies. We have a lot of flooding ongoing in the Midwest right now. And so, we really needed to sharpen our skills on dealing with flash floods as well as river floods, because that's been a huge story throughout the middle part of the country. And, it just depends. We've got to be flexible and adaptable because the weather's always changing.
When you look across your portfolio of training, of education, of understanding kind of your role and your strategy as the Chief Learning Officer, are there certain challenges you face day in and day out that maybe other CXOs maybe don't face as much? I mean, from your perspective, you're again, we talked from the beginning, you're more cheerleader than, the person, kind of banging their fist saying, do what I say.
Right. Yeah, it's the biggest challenge is trying to meet all the needs. And it's difficult because there's, it's reality. No matter what business you're in, you could always use more resources. There's always going to be more demand. There's more need than you've got resources to cover. And so the real challenge is trying to find that sweet spot. And, how do you really serve the field the best and also implement those national initiatives that we're trying to do? We're juggling a lot of budget portfolios. Most of the managers are dealing with one pot of money. I'm dealing with 6 pots of money. And so it drives my budget officer crazy, but she does a fantastic job. So it's unique in that we're also kind of quasi act like a entrepreneurial part of government, and that we're working with our customers to find out what the demand is, and then we're working with our stakeholders and the funders to try to make sure that we can get the resources that we need. So I think it does make it a little bit unique. It's a tough puzzle to solve, but it's a lot of fun actually, because my role as a CLO, I know a lot about training. I've got staff who are much bigger experts in training than I am or will ever be. My role is to try to fight and get them the resources they need so they can do their job and meet the needs of the field.
You talk about your role a little bit. Maybe we should go down that path, because your role has also changed. Now, you said you've been in it, I think you said about 3 years? Is
30.
That
30 years.
But
I've been in 30 years in government.
But
Officially as a chief learning officer for about 3 years.
And that's also changing in terms of what your role is. And each role at a agency for the CLO is a little different. Can you maybe just talk through kind of what your day-to-day is? Give me a sense of how that day-to-day also changes in terms of whether it's the seasonal readiness piece, or what season you guys are in to ensure you're meeting your mission.
Yeah, most of my days are I'm a government employee. I spend a lot of time on conference calls, but again, I'm remote from DC, so I'm working daily with the Weather Service headquarters folks in Silver Spring. I'm back there about every 6 weeks on average, so I'm interacting with our stakeholders and our funders all the time. But I'm also working with the field offices and our regional headquarters all the time as well, trying to identify the best resources out there. How it's really changed is that becoming a part of senior leadership. And so I'm interacting with the director, the deputy director, the chief financial officer, the chief operations officer all the time, and trying to make sure that we've got the resources we can to do the job. In the past, it had been working a lot with the field and collecting those requirements and what their field needs are for training, and trying to make that balance. And as I mentioned earlier, acting more entrepreneurial. How can we come up with creative solutions to our training needs that fit within our budget? And so you tend to run a little bit more like a business than a government agency might necessarily do. So it's been a real mental shift for me, and I found myself training and working on business classes and sales and managing and project management and things like that, because hopefully that makes me a better chief learning officer as well.
And do you miss your days as a meteorologist? Do you sometimes want to roll the sleeves up and get involved in a big weather event?
Yeah, I do. I mean, it's in your blood. I don't miss the shift work by any means. I understand why people don't like working rotating shifts. I did it for a number of years, but I'm still a weather geek at heart. I've got the radar apps on my phone. We had a tornado that occurred here a couple of weeks ago. I was out of town at a different conference, and I was sitting at dinner just completely geeking out and watching this storm go by. Actually freaking out a little bit too, because the track of the tornado was going close to home. So, doing my own radar interpretation, watching the Weather Service radars, texting with my family, helping and making sure that they're taking shelter, just as everybody ought to be.
And everything was okay?
Yeah, fortunately, there was a lot of damage on the southwest part of town, and fortunately the tornado dissipated before it went over our area. But that's just the way tornadoes go, and we got lucky this time.
Good news for your family and obviously your home. John, we're just about out of time. Before I let you go, we spent a lot of time talking about the current state of training. We spent a lot of time talking about where you've been and how you got to where you are today. If we have this conversation again in 2 years and 3 years, where do you see your role as the CLO and more or less training and education at the National Weather Service going?
I think a big part of it is doing things like this and talking about what we're doing and some of our success stories. But in addition to that, working more with the external partners to learn more, to find best practices across other parts of government, other parts of the private sector, And I'm hopeful that we're serving our field better because ultimately they're my customer. Are we getting them the training they need at the right time so they can do the job and meet the mission of the Weather Service, and that is saving lives and property?
Very nice. Let me thank my guest today, John Ogren, the Chief Learning Officer of the National Weather Service, which is a part of NOAA in the Department of Commerce. John, thank you so much for your time and your flexibility with doing the video teleconference. This worked out great.
Yeah, I appreciate it. Thanks much.
I'm Jason Miller, and you've been listening to the discussion Providing a Modern Learning Experience, sponsored by Cornerstone On Demand on Federal News Radio, part of the Federal News Network. For more on this discussion, visit federalnewsnetwork.com and search Cornerstone.